Hello. We are excited about this guest today. She is a friend of ours and pretty big in the adoptee community. Some of you may know her from her one woman show, Unmothered, which we got to see in New York, which was life-changing. And she also runs Migrating Toward Wholeness. That might be the correct name. Welcome, Dr. Liz DeBetta, coming to us from Plymouth, Michigan.
Hi, thanks so much for
Liz,
having
I'm
me.
so happy you're here. And I was just going to respond to Unmothered and seeing it. It absolutely was life changing. It brought stuff up so that were
Mm,
so deep in me, and it took me days to recover from it, as you know.
mm.
But it led me to EMDR, and so anyway, I thank you for that. It's
Yes,
an
thank you.
incredible show, incredible. So.
We sat there grabbing each other's hands through it, like, what, So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And also I'm so glad you got to see Unmothered and that it meant so much to you because it means so much to me to be able to share that work with other adoptees and people that are not even connected to adoption because it's so important that our stories and our internal experiences are heard and mirrored and like knowing Sarah that you started your own EMDR journey as a result of that is hugely validating for me because the whole reason I decided to write and perform and continue to perform the show was because it was part of my healing journey and I was writing it at the same time that I was going through my own EMDR process, but also that like I wanted people to know that there are things available, right? That we can find ways to heal. We just have to be ready for them.
And
Mhm.
and for our listeners, it's a one woman show literally about being an adoptee. And
Mhm.
I think personally it should be on a Netflix special. Like everybody should see it because then I think you would say, oh, that's how adoptees feel without
Or a I was at a
TED
TEDx
Talk.
event last night, and
Yeah.
I thought that there's a missing piece here, and it's our voices.
Mm,
I know there have been TED Talks about adoption, but it was very somebody was talking about suicidal ideation, and I wanted to
mm.
yell out, "Do you know that adoptees are 4 times more?" You know.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up TEDx because that's something that I'm working on right now
Oh,
is getting ready to submit my application for TEDx Detroit, which is happening
good.
in September because exactly for that reason. And in fact, I was just talking to my therapist earlier today about that I'm working on that and how that's a space that is a really important space for our voices to be heard
Yes.
and it's often missing. We're not getting into those mainstream conversations as much as we can or should, and I think the world is a little bit more open to it now, so I'm hoping that I will be accepted and then I will get to give that talk because
Oh, be great.
yeah.
Yes.
And before we dig into your story, because we would like to hear your story, we don't know all of your story. Tell a little bit about migrating toward wholeness as well.
Yeah, so migrating toward wholeness is sort of the companion to unmothered, right? So much of my work has come out of my lifelong experience of using writing as a tool for healing. But like way before I even knew that was a thing. I started writing poetry when I was 14 because I just had all of these big feelings. And you know this part of my story because it's part of Unmothered. But I had all these big feelings and I didn't know what to do with them. So I got a notebook and I started writing at the suggestion of a very insightful and caring teacher and coach whom I is still, in contact. I'm still in contact with today. George Anthony's light in my life, I will
Hmm.
say, because without that sort of nudge, I don't know that I would be sitting here today talking to you both, but also having developed the Migrating Toward Wholeness work because that was an outgrowth of really digging into the concept and the theories behind writing as a tool for healing, in particular, in poetry in particular, during my graduate study. And then I was part of the 2019 cohort of the Rudd Adoption Summer Adoption Research Institute. And they, in 2021, came to me and said, we're so interested in this writing and healing work that you're doing. And we're doing this year-long conference on adult adoptees. And is there something that you can put together for us as part of this year-long conference that we're doing online? And I thought, well, what if I, pilot this thing that I've been thinking about and work with other adoptees using the techniques of writing that I've used and see what happens. And they were like, yes, that sounds awesome. And so I ran this pilot program where we got together for 7 weeks and wrote and shared. And the
Oh my
process was
gosh, cool.
really emergent. It wasn't me showing up with a script and going like, and here are the writing prompts that we're going to use. It was really me trusting that I had already developed the tools and that I was going to listen to the people that were in the room and that we were going to share our experiences. And out of that, we came up with some beautiful writing that then informed the writing of my book, Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal, Migrating Toward Wholeness, which is now the Migrating Toward Wholeness process and program that I offered as a tool for people to come together in intentionally small groups and it's not about how you write, it's about what you write. So we're looking at what's coming up in the writing, and then we're working with that to build a more coherent narrative. And that's a very simplified.
We'll put this in the show notes too, so people can find it, because there's probably a lot of people interested who have no idea. No?
Yeah, it's super powerful, and I'm open to talking to folks, more in depth anytime. In fact, that's how a lot of people find me, is they hear me on podcasts and then they email me and they're like, I want to know more about this. So yeah.
Well,
excellent.
Yeah. And so now we want to kind of hear your, how you want to tell it. Doesn't have to be traditional, however you want to talk about your story as a fellow adoptee here.
Yeah. So I guess let me start at the beginning. And I feel like I'm having a Sound of Music moment. Let's start at the very beginning.
Right?
Right? It's my musical theater kid background. In fact, that's actually the first show that I was in. I was in a summer theater camp and I was real tiny for my age. So I played Gretel in the Sound.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Kind of apropos of the
right.
motherless children and
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't even made that connection. See, I mean, we make these connections all the time, and it's adults were like, "Oh, yeah," I deeply identified, and I was like, and my line was, "And my birthday's on Tuesday, and I would like a pink parasol." Practice. It was the only thing I got to say, pretty much. Gretel doesn't say very much. I was like, I'm gonna get that right. I'm gonna be perfect at this, but. Yeah, so I mean, maybe that's a good starting point. Like I have always known that I was adopted. It was not a secret necessarily in my family. I was technically adopted at birth, but I did not go home with my parents until I was 9 months old. And so there's this whole
it's a long time.
First 9 months of my life that were really what I have thought of and felt as a gaping black hole, right? Because I don't know where I was. I don't know who I was with. And I don't know, the level of care that I was receiving. And part of that is because I was born prematurely. So I was 2 pounds, 11 ounces. Yeah, in 1977. Right. So
that's a big deal now. So
it's exactly. And in 1977, we didn't have, the technology and the knowledge and all of that. And so, in retrospect, I realized that clearly I had something to live for. Right. Like little baby Liz was like, I got to get out in the world and do something, even though it's too soon. And then I survived being that small. I survived being separated from my mother. I survived, that 9 months of interim care where they were a supposedly, allegedly, apparently attending to my medical needs before determining that I was, adoptable, or that I could go home with my adoptive parents. And like, these are all details that are still kind of fuzzy, right?
Mhm.
Because I don't have access to much information like most of us. I have.
Where were you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was adopted in New Jersey. I was born in New Jersey and adopted in New Jersey.
And your biological mother, did she leave the hospital right away or was she there for a while? Do you know any of that?
I don't know. I think she left the hospital. I don't think she was in the hospital for very long. What I do know from her, because I am in reunion with her, and I'll kind of get to that piece of the story in a minute. But I do know that she told me when we first reconnected and we were starting to have conversations, that when she went to the hospital, because she had started premature labor, they put her on an alcohol drip
Mm.
to stop the labor. And she tried to tell them not that she didn't want that, and they didn't listen to her. And I have done some research, and I can't quite figure out what an alcohol drip is.
It doesn't sound like something that should
Good.
be going into the veins.
Yeah. I
Jeez.
mean, and what, her words were that she was like, I was so mad because I didn't want to be drugged, and I didn't want you to be drugged coming into the world. But she, was not given a choice.
No, I was gonna say she probably had no rights about it.
How
You know,
old was she?
she was just barely 19. Um, yeah. And she had, had witnessed her a younger sister about a year prior be forced into having an abortion,
Mm.
and felt really strongly that she wasn't going to do that. And also, she had no support from her family. They were unwilling to help her raise me. They were not going to give her any kind of, emotional or financial or any other kind of support. And the choice was like, you're either on your own and you figure it out, or you have an abortion. Um, and yeah, and she, was dating someone else who I found out years later was not my biological father, even though his information is on my non-identifying
Mm.
paperwork. So like,
Yes.
it's not uncommon that adoptees paperwork is all kinds of, I'm going to say fakakta, right?
Yeah.
Like that there are
Yeah.
mistruths
Right.
and and lies and misinformation, and then we, the little information we're allowed to have, we construct a story around it, and we think that's something, and then you find out, 20 years later,
Yeah.
that's actually not true. So then I found out, also when she and I first reconnected and started talking, that he had gone to the adoption agency with her because he refused to raise another man's child.
Oh,
And he,
Another
and
level of shame for her.
yeah,
interesting though. What interesting, right? So just thinking about that, a man not wanting to raise somebody else's child. We are adoptees, and sometimes, you wonder, I don't know.
Yes.
It's just something that pops into my head, like
No,
how
I thought,
adoptive fathers, like, this isn't really my child.
yeah. I mean, you bring up the shame, right? And there's like so many layers of shame uh, embedded in just in patriarchy, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
embedded in
yeah.
the socialized and internalized ways of being that we have, because like toxic masculinity, and this concept that, well, that's not my child, so how could I possibly raise that child, even if that's what she wanted. And then, but it's okay, but then the sort of paradox of, it's okay to give that to child to another man whose child it also isn't, is, to your point, Sarah, to raise. So like,
Because it's through a different scope. And like, yeah, it's very
it's
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the complexity of adoption, right? Of our experience as adopted people, that like there are all of these layers to the story that are so much bigger than what's on the surface,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So much. Gosh.
We,
So
yeah.
he is like, okay, I'm going with you to the adoption agency because I'm not sticking around if you do this.
Yeah, and she, I think, from what she has shared with me, very much felt like she was trying to give herself a better life, and the only option that she had was sticking with this guy for some kind of stability that she didn't have with her family that she grew up in.
Mhm.
And I don't want to speak too much for her, but this
Right.
is, in as many as of the conversations as we've had, this is kind of what I've come to understand, is that she felt that she was trying to have a life, and that if he wasn't going to be accepting of her keeping me and raising me, then that she was doing the only thing that she could, and at least giving me some kind of an opportunity at life as well.
Yeah.
Right. But the well, I mean, I can't essentialize it into the tragic part of this, but like one of the tragedies of this is that, like, to now, every time I talk to her, she's still very apologetic, you know.
Mm,
And I, this is something I talk about in Unmothered, right? The
Yeah.
part about, that I know she feels guilty because she apologizes every time that we speak. And it's about like any number of things. It's like she's just always like, I'm sorry I don't call enough. I'm sorry am not, you know, as in touch with you as I'd like to be. I'm sorry, I'm sorry I, sent your birthday card late. And like, and that breaks my heart because I I don't I don't I don't I don't want her to be sorry,
Yeah.
right? Like at some point,
another patriarchal thing, isn't it? Women feeling the need to apologize.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and there's so many parts of her life that I now know have been so hard.
Yeah.
Um and that and there were so many parallels in our stories, that this man that she ended up, staying with and having three more children with, and then ended up divorcing because he was abusive and manipulative. My first marriage,
All right.
like I married a person for the same reason, that I thought I was getting this sort of security and stability, and that I could like start to have my own life. And then it turned out to be a really horrible situation. And so learning, years later, when I did finally marry my first mom, that we had both been through abusive marriages, I was like, oh, talk
Oh,
about like
that's interesting. Yes,
intergenerational and epigenetic trauma, and the way
Right.
that we
for
pass
sure.
these things down. And then when, for us as adopted people, if we don't know those parts of our stories, we don't even know the patterns we might be repeating,
Right.
you know? Um,
Right. We don't have the information available to us to.
I
mhm.
find that so interesting what you're saying. I have all these letters from my mother for throughout the years until she died in 1976, and I repeated many of her patterns. And interesting, it's just how you're saying it is. There's always a light bulb, even with us. All these interviews, it's like,
Mhm.
oh, another light bulb.
Yeah.
So you were in NICU for
Mhm.
9 months. And your adoptive parents, were they in the process of adopting you? Were they able to come see you, or was it not until you were 9 months till?
You know, Again, this is a little bit of a fuzzy area for me. The story that I was told, that my adoptive parents, my parents who raised me, told me, was that they came to see me. My mom actually told me that she would sneak vitamins in and give me vitamins. I
Huh,
don't know. It's
okay.
possible. I, so that's the kind of the story that she told me. So I think that they were able to come see me. Um, because there was a sort of a tentative agreement in place, because the other part of the story, I have a older brother who's also adopted, and my parents had adopted him 14 months earlier. and then got a call from the adoption agency saying, we have another baby. And because I had been born prematurely, and they had a lot of question marks about my health and other things, they weren't sure if I was going to have special needs or extra needs. And so they, the story that I was told was that they felt like my parents were good people to put me with because my mom was already home raising my brother. And that, that they would, there would be, that she would have the capacity to care for me if I had extra needs.
Were they not really looking to adopt at that time because they had just adopted? It was more of a phone call towards them.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's the interesting thing. And, I think, from what I've learned in studying some of the history is that it, typically was one child per family at the time. And so it was interesting that they got this particular phone call, and the way my mom has always told it is that because they were teachers, they were, writing check every month to pay the fees. And every month my mom would send a little note and with the check. And I guess, for whatever reason, the social workers felt like, oh, like we've got this person that seems like they might be willing, right, to take on another child, and the child whose needs might be greater than, because also, like, if I were, let's say crippled, right, I had one of my hip joints had not fully opened, so my leg wasn't in the proper place. And so, like, what if I was crippled or couldn't walk properly, like that, like, most people wouldn't want that kind of child, right?
Right. Sadly.
Yeah. So yeah.
What were your parents, did they have problems with fertility? I mean,
Yeah.
very,
That's
very
it.
typical, right? For adoptees.
Yeah. I mean, they got, they had gotten married in 1966, and sort of also from the story that I had been told, from very early on, is that they tried for a number of years, I'm going to say about 8 years or so, unsuccessfully, to have children. And they went for testing and couldn't, none of the tests were conclusive, and they couldn't figure out whose fault it was, right? But then in quotes, whose fault it was, or what, what the problem was. And it's just that they weren't getting pregnant, and that they decided that they wanted to have children, and that if they couldn't have their own children, they would adopt, right? And that's always the sort of default, like, obvious choice to a lot of people. Like, obviously, like, well, we'll just adopt, right? And so that's what they did. And, and
Isn't it just kind of I mean, it's just, this is going through my head, but just nobody ever thinks about what that really means, right?
No.
It's so I'd like a baby, I'd like a child. If I can't have my own, I'll just adopt. And there's so much more to it that people just don't understand or care to dig into, or it's such a, I don't know. It
I
is
didn't always understand. That's why this is so important to educate people.
Yeah, and I think that's true, right? I didn't always understand either. As a kid, I thought that, I like, this is just my family, right? And
Yeah.
there's, like, this is just how my family is, and it's fine. And like, I think to an extent that's true, right? And as I got older, I also realized that there was something different about me, that I didn't feel quite right inside, that I didn't feel quite like I fit in my family, as much love as I had, right? As much as I loved them, as much as I knew they loved me, like, I didn't look like anybody else in my family. And, like, my favorite holiday as a kid was St. Patrick's Day, and I grew up in this, big Italian American family. Right? And my joke now has become, I'm only Italian in the kitchen,
Right.
which is probably the most important place, right?
Yes.
Because I can cook some good food. But, like, you know, I was, and then interestingly, when I did DNA, I found out that I am like 35% Irish.
Yeah,
And
you were drawn to it.
like my cells knew, like my body knew.
Yeah.
Me
Yeah.
too. I
You
am too.
know.
Had the same being drawn to Irish accents, Irish people, everything
Mhm.
Ireland.
Yeah, since I've
Mhm.
known you. That's interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
how and your brother, did you get along with him? So he wasn't much older than you.
Right. So he's 14 months older than I am. And that's kind of a painful part of my story. Because we were really close as kids growing up.
I remember.
And, you know, we sort of, when I finally read The Primal Wound, when I finally got to that point in my life where I realized how much adoption, being adopted had affected me, and I needed to start to sort of intellectually understand it before I could do the emotional healing and the psychological healing around what I needed to reconcile for myself. I read The Primal Wound and I was like, oh, that's my family. Like my brother and I were like, you know, each of those adoptees, right? Like he was the one that acted out all the time. I
Yeah.
was the overachieving, competent one. We played each of those roles very, and I could see that, throughout our teens and everything. And so as kids, we were really close. And then my younger brother was born in 1982. He was my parents' biological son,
So
and he
they
was
did
born.
get pregnant.
They did, and he was
Mm.
born with Down syndrome,
Oh,
and that really changed the focus of our family significantly because he he was born with a disability, and this was just after deinstitutionalization. So like there weren't a lot of services in place yet. They were working on things, and my parents had to do a lot of work to figure out what his needs were and how to get them met. And from the time he was like 17 days old. And
mhm.
so at that point in time, my brother and I were like 5 and 6 years old. And we just kind of stopped talking about adoption and being adopted in my family. And like my brother and I still, talked about it because that was a thing we had in common. Then as we got older, into our teenage years, and he kind of got into some bad things and bad, not the right people. And, you know, and now in, hindsight, I understand why
Yeah.
that happened. And my coping mechanisms were, on the other spectrum, where I was like very good at school and kept myself busy all the time. And I was on like 2 different teams, and I did community theater, and I had a part-time job. Sometimes I had 2 part-time jobs, like I was just
Yeah.
busy all the time. And, as we have gotten to be adults, our journeys have been very different, and we're very different people. And in the last couple of years, like we don't have a relationship anymore because of some really hurtful things that he has said to me, and that you know were are like really damaging, and don't make me feel safe. And we have never
Sorry.
been.
That's hard. Yeah.
It's really hard, and I don't talk a lot about that part of my story because I wish that I could have my brother in
Yeah.
my life. But there is so much collateral damage in being adopted, in adoption. And
Mm.
this is part of it, is that my brother and I are very different people. And as much as I would love to have a conversation with him and for him to be curious and say, hey, why did you need to find your biological family? Why do you need to do
Yeah.
the work that you do? Why, instead of being angry, and he's just really angry.
Yeah.
And like I, the both the, sister part of me, but also the Dr. Liz part of me sees that very hurt little boy,
Yeah.
right? That's still in there. And I understand that because I have a very hurt little girl inside of me. But I can take care of her now, and that's been my journey, is learning how to take care of her
Yeah.
and nurture her and love her. And accept that I can both have deep gratitude for the life that I have lived and also deep sadness for the one that I didn't get to have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it.
Adoptees live in the and, right? Isn't that YouTube that the woman put out recently where we live in the and? You can and this and that. You can do both,
Yeah.
And
I
maybe
talk
your
about
brother
this.
will come to you sometime. We're still not that
Yeah.
old.
Yeah, it's true. There's still time, right? And I do hold on to a tiny piece of hope, and I do hope that, but
Yeah.
but also one of the things that I have worked hard to do for myself is learn how to have boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Like for us as adoptees, that's so challenging.
Yeah.
Especially when we grow up in the circumstances that teach us that we have to fit in no matter what. And I think that leads to like a lack of healthy boundaries, that we're just going to be everything to everyone all of the time in order to feel safe and in order to not
Yeah.
have people leave us. But as kids, we don't know that. I certainly didn't. I just knew that, like, I needed to stay safe.
Yeah.
And now part of
Whatever it takes,
Whatever.
however that unfolds, right? Just
Mhm.
sometimes I think twisting ourselves into pretzels to be what we thought people wanted, what was the only safety we knew, right?
Mhm.
But we're so good at being chameleons.
Oh my gosh. I just told Sarah this week that I'm still working on boundaries. Like I, overachieved and fixed and made sure everyone's happy and I'm like, stop, right? It's very difficult. And I feel like if there was like a little art thing, we'd all be wandering around, like bumping into each other with our lack of boundaries. It's,
Yeah.
and
So your younger brother comes along and that
right.
changes the family dynamic.
Yeah.
What happens from there?
Yeah, so I guess, so like I said, we just kind of then stopped talking about adoption. It became like, what I have said before and written about, is sort of this like non-issue, right? And like, to be fair, my parents, like so many of our parents, didn't know
Right.
Right.
that that there was trauma associated with maternal separation and in the act of adopting the experience of adoption, that we were going to need help. They were just raising it, what Betty Jean Lifton talks about, as if, right? That, they were taught, like, they were just supposed to act as if we were like any other family and that it didn't matter. And
Because we're blank slates is what they thought.
right. And that the love
Yeah.
was going to be just like love us enough, and that, and everything else didn't matter, right? It was going to be okay. They didn't know that we were going to need any support around our
Um,
identity as adoptees. And, so then my brother went down the one path. I went down the other path, and I have, spent my life. I got a PhD because that was my coping mechanism, right?
yeah.
But but we stopped talking about it, and so it became another, became kind of a secret in my family, and that's part of what has caused the tension that exists now with my brother and I. It's because I understand that he would rather not talk about it or think about it or have it be an aspect of that's him, of his identity that's important to acknowledge. um, and that I am over here very publicly sharing my story and helping other people to grapple with their own stories and find a greater sense of healing and wholeness in the act of, you know, finding a
Yeah.
voice and breaking silences around these things that we're told not to talk about. And so, you know, my family, we stopped talking about it. And, you know, in fact, my brother Frank, my younger brother, doesn't know that we're adopted.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. You know, and he's now 42 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it's like, wow, okay. You know, like,
How is your
so
relationship with the parents that raised you now? Like, how do
I
you,
have a very good relationship with them. I mean, you know, I think there's always tension. You know, there certainly has been a lot of tension in the last almost decade as I've really stepped into this journey of finding myself, figuring out where I came from and what that means and who my biological family is and meeting my first mom and then the you know just the experience of writing and performing my story and having my parents be like, what are you doing?
Did they see your performance?
They have seen it several times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
They they saw it when I originally performed it as part of my dissertation work. And you know that you know, and in my dissertation, I actually part of the last chapter is about the really difficult and sometimes painful conversations that came up with them as a result of me doing this work of me like figuring out how to tell a story that was mine and not the story that they had, you know, handed me. And this is a thing that I talk about that comes up in the work, the Migrating Toward Wholeness work too, is the idea of becoming the subject in our own stories, right?
Yeah.
Because as adoptees, we're objects, right? And like they still, in some ways, like very, very much see me as an object, and I have had to work really hard to make myself the subject. And Unmothered is one of the ways that I've done that. But like that was a really painful process because it brought up so much stuff for them.
Oh, I'm sure.
And for me, and things that I had to open up conversations about because they were not coming to me directly and going, we have a question about this, right? And so then I had to do that work because I am pretty attuned to them, and like all of a sudden I wasn't hearing from them. You know, they weren't like calling me or checking in, and I was like, okay, something's up, you know. And then I would call them and they'd be like, so what is this unmothered thing? Okay.
You know, it's really brave. You know, I thought it was brave in putting everybody together at a wedding and making people have relationships. This is a whole nother, it really is. It's like, because we've seen your performance and it's very soulful and
Thank you.
pulls everything out. So I can imagine for them it must be but it's good. You know what? It's good you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as painful as some of that process was, there's also a lot of good in it, in that like they get to experience the story in as a piece of theater, and that's one of the connections that I've had to my parents over the years is our love of theater. And you know, in fact, that's how I got into theater. They were both high school English and theater teachers. You know, and I'm like some of my first memories growing up were going to rehearsals with my dad on the weekends for the shows that he was directing when he was still teaching high school. And then as I got older with my mom, being part of, you know, her rehearsal processes, and then deciding, you know, when I was about 14, at the same time I started writing poetry, that I really wanted to do theater. And I started doing, you know, doing community theater. And that was really a lifeline for me, right? Because I had so much inside that I didn't know at the time was attached to the trauma that I was carrying, and I needed to put it somewhere. And so the writing was one way. that I was able to manage those big emotions. But the theater was another way because I got to go live someone else's life, right? And for like, you know, the couple of hours of rehearsal or the 2 hours of performance, like I got to be somebody else and not feel chaotic and confused about like my own confusing life, right? Like I could pretend that I was somebody else and put all of that emotional energy into that person's life for a time. And I think, I know that that is partially what saved me because, you know, we were talking earlier about that 4 times more likely statistic that as adopted people, we are much higher rates of significant mental health challenges as well as suicidal ideation and dying by suicide. And I know that if I did not have those lifelines at that, you know, those formative years, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you right now.
Yeah.
At what point did you decide to go seeking your family?
Yeah. So, you know, I sort of spent my teens and 20s, like most of us do, trying to self-actualize, right? Trying to figure out who I was and what I was doing with my life and what my career path was going to be. But those years were also years that I was labeled as very depressed and was in therapy, but not talking about adoption and just having these bouts of what was at the time categorized as major depression and not knowing why, right?
Yeah.
And just feeling really awful a lot of the time. And then when I got into college, I I kept, you know, I had this breakup, and it hit me really hard. And I started thinking like, maybe I need to know something about who I am and where I came from. And so it's probably about 1998. I, you know, was 97 or 98. I was talking with one of my sorority sisters and like sort of, and she was like, you know, have you ever learned anything about where you were adopted from or who your, you know, parents might be? And I was like, no, I don't know. I don't even know how to get that information. Like, I don't even know where to start. And she was like, well, what do you know? And I'm like, well, I know the hospital I was born. So she's like, well, I'm going to call them. She
I like
didn't have a
those
clue.
friends.
Yeah. And she was like, why not? I was like, okay. And she's obviously, you know, couldn't get any information from the hospital, but that sort of got me thinking like maybe I needed to figure out some stuff. So it was at that point that I got my non-identifying information. I wrote away to the agency and I, you know, sent them the $100 or whatever it was. And they sent me a copy of my file with everything redacted. And, you know, I remember reading it at the time and looking at the information such as it was and starting to like kind of piece together a bit of a story, but like also reading the list of books that was suggested reading, you know, The Primal Wound, and Journey of the Adopted Self, and Being Adopted, The Lifelong Search for Self, and all, you know, all of those sort of seminal texts that had just been published a couple of years before, and thinking, oh, but why would I want to read this? You know, like I don't feel wounded. Like I don't feel, you know, right. Like still not putting two and two together, but having this information and starting to feel like, okay, well, I know some things. And then I kind of hit a dead end because I wasn't going to pay them another, whatever, $1,500 for their search fee, which they couldn't guarantee would turn up anything anyway. You know, there was very carefully couched language around like, you can pay us this money and we'll institute a search, but we can't guarantee that there will be any information more than what's already here. And I was just like angry. I was like, well, what do I have to pay you more money for? And also, you know, and the internet was like infant stages, right? You have to like, you know, go to the computer lab and like log on to GeoCities and like, Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the same year 1997, 98 is when I was searching too. So
And I kind of got frustrated. And then I was like, well, I'm a college student. I'm just gonna keep forward. So I put that paperwork away, and I, kept it for another time. And then, and then 7 or 8 years later, when I got married to my ex-husband, I kind of started thinking about it again. And I was like, maybe I need to, and it's the sort of classic, maybe I need to know my medical history,
All right. Yeah.
right? Because now I'm married and we might have kids, and I'm going to need to know something, right? If I have kids. And so I took the paperwork out again and I revisited it, and I, again, tried to see what I could find out, and I couldn't get very far. And I kind of gave up again and just like forgot about it. I was like, okay, well, I don't know what I didn't know that I had no idea that there were search angels. I had no idea, like the idea of like hiring a private investigator was like, I can't afford that. And I don't know that, like, what that's going to do. And that seems crazy to me. And so maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's just not that important.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's, so I kind of put it to the side again. But then, you know, maybe, close to another decade later, I, had been married and divorced, had gone through that whole really bad experience, and hit a wall. I was probably like 37, and I was like, oh, okay. I just got out of another really unhealthy relationship. I just
Yeah.
spent, however many years of my life with this person who is not good for me, who's emotionally unavailable, who treats me like shit and makes me feel like shit. Fortunately, I was strong enough at that point to just to say I'm done and get out of it. But then I got out of it and I was like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Right. I realized at that point how stuck I felt, and I started to think about my patterns in relationships, and it became really apparent to me that something needed to shift if I was ever going to have healthy relationships, both with myself and with other people,
Yeah.
right? That like I needed to feel like I was moving forward in my life, because at the time I felt like a hamster on a wheel, like I was constantly moving really quickly and going nowhere,
Yeah.
and that felt really frustrating for me. And I just kind of felt stuck. I felt really stuck, and I was like, something has to shift, something has to change. And coincidentally, I was finishing the last 2 credits of my master's degree, which had been, hanging over me for like 14 years almost, because my ex-husband wouldn't let me go back to school and finish those last 2 credits.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a lot of, there was some stuff that happened that made me put those last 2 credits on hold, related to some family situations and my own health. And then of course his abusive and manipulative, like sociopathic behavior. It's good I can laugh about it now, but
Yeah.
that,
Oh,
I wasn't allowed to finish that. And then I tried, and the person wouldn't readmit me to the program. And then, sort of turn of events, sometimes the universe takes care of you. I ran into a friend who I had done a lot of the coursework with, who was like, what do you mean you never finished? That's crazy. I'm like, I know, I tried, but here's what happened. And she's like, well, let me put you in touch with somebody who I think can help you. And so I was re-enrolled, and I was getting ready to, I was working on these last 2 credits, which was independent study. To, um, I didn't need to take another class, but the coordinator of the program said to me, might be nice for you to take a class. It might be nice for you to feel like you're part of the department again. And I was like, sure, that sounds like a good idea. And to this day, I don't know why she recommended the class that she did, but she said, there's this class in autobiographical writing, and I think you might really enjoy it. And you might consider that. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. Sure. You know, and And it was in that class that I started writing about being adopted. Because what the big project, which then became half of my 2 required master's thesis papers, was a long personal narrative. We had to write about a significant life event, and I was like, the hell do I have to write about? You know, I didn't feel like I had a story to tell. I didn't feel like there was anything that was significant enough that I could devote, like, you know, 15, 20 pages to. And I like, you know, I was like stressed about it. And I had a really hard time. And then one day we were sitting in class, and one of my classmates was reading her draft of her story, which was about her sister and how they looked like twins, and how everybody mistaked them for twins, and how close they were, and how they shared each other's clothes, and all this, like, this stuff. And I'm sitting there, and I start bawling in the middle of this
Oh.
class. Here I am, like a grown adult, weeping openly, and people are like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, I think so. And then I said, you know, but I'm adopted, and I have no idea who I look like. I have no idea if I have a sister. And I've always thought about that. And it just like brought all of this stuff to the surface for me. And my professor looked at me and said, well, why don't you write about that?
Mhm.
And I was like, what? Being adopted? And she said, yes. And I said, I don't know anything.
Oh,
Like,
that
how am
small
I
thing being adopted.
Yeah.
right? But I didn't know anything. So I was like, how can and she's like, well, do me a favor, just think about it. And I said, okay, I will think about it. And I thought about it. And then I ended up writing this piece called Unanswered Questions, which then a year later I won an award for at a social change conference, best personal narrative. But it was a struggle to tell that story. And so that's the moment at which I started to kind of go down this path of like figuring out what my story was, you know,
Yeah.
you know, what it meant to be adopted. And then a year or so later, my amazing, beautiful, wonderful partner, Jeremy, and I moved to Utah so that he could take a job at a university. And having the geographical and emotional distance from my family finally allowed me to start thinking about searching, because I had, you know, had written this personal story that helped me really start to see myself in a different way. I had been doing the reading. I started doing, you know, the research that I needed to do to intellectually understand the impact of adoption. And he read a lot of these books with me, you know, and we talked about a lot of them early on. But so you know, I was reading the books and I was getting a clearer picture, and like, you know, what we all now talk about is coming out of the fog and really going, oh, like this has impacted me in so many ways for so long. I had no idea. And now the next thing that I need to be able to do is try to search, right? Try to finally, you know, third time is the charm. Kind of
Yeah.
really like, I'm ready for this now, you know. And I had started to and so this was the very end of 2016, beginning of 2017. I had just, you know, a couple months before started interacting with some of the online Facebook groups that are specific to adoption, and learning from people, and like seeing, you know, okay, like there are other people out there, like there are other adopted people who have similar feelings, and it's not just me. Um and Jeremy had given me a DNA kit for Christmas, and then, you know, I spit in the tube and I sent it away, like, you know, just after Christmas, right before the new year. And then I was on one of those Facebook groups, and somebody posted a link to say that the law in New Jersey had changed, and that I could access my original birth certificate. You know, it was
Yeah.
it's restricted access, so it's not, you know, you don't get everything. But I thought, okay, great. So I downloaded the forms and filled them out, and I had to send them back 3 times because they kept sending them back to me because it was missing this, and I forgot to include that, and it was very annoying. But then on my 40th birthday, I got a copy of my birth certificate in the mail. And when I opened it and it had Mary's name on it, like I finally knew who, you know, she had a name, right? And then we went online and we, you know, did the thing that all adoptees are really good at, which is Facebook stalking and
Yeah. Stock.
research. And you know, within a couple of hours, we had found enough information that and cross-referenced it, and we were like, okay, that's who it is, and that's where she lives. And ironically, she was living in the same part of New Jersey that I had lived in with my
Gosh.
ex-husband. Like I couldn't run into her
Anywhere.
yeah, in the years that I was living and working there.
So you called her and
So I sent her a message on Facebook Messenger because I didn't, you know, that was the easiest way, because she had a Facebook account. And then I wrote the same thing in a handwritten note and I put it in the mail because I also found her address because I thought, oh, maybe she doesn't check her Facebook messages. And so
then sometimes those messengers, if you're not friends, go
Yes,
to a
right.
different folder and
yeah, exactly. It goes into the black hole. So I figured, let me put it in the mail too. But she got the Facebook message and then she wrote back to me. She, you know, and she told me, like, I've been waiting for this day for 40 years.
Oh, yes.
In fact, in my show, those letters are the actual letters, right?
Yeah.
If you remember that part, right?
Yeah,
Like that's
I
what I wrote to
remember.
her and what she wrote back to me. And then, you know, this was in 2017, you know, around March of 2017. And we started, you know, emailing, you know, back and forth. And then we started having phone conversations. And and then that summer, again, in sort of a random twist of fate, I was visiting my parents for a few days, and my best friend and I had plans to get together, and we were supposed to get together on Staten Island, but she had to go back to Jersey for her kids because her husband had a work emergency. And she was like, can we meet in New Jersey instead of going out on Staten Island? And I was like, yeah, as long as I can get a car, no problem. You know, and so I ended up saying, yeah, I can meet you. And she told me where to meet her. And as I'm driving over the outer bridge into New Jersey from Staten Island, I realized that I'm going to the same town that my first mom lives in. I pull into the parking lot of the restaurant that I'm meeting my friend at. And I put in the map, her address, and it's like 5 minutes down the road. So I sit there for a minute and I'm like, okay, do I text her? Do I see if she wants to meet? Like what? And then I'm like, you know what? Why not? So I text her and I'm like, hey, this is totally random and feel free to say no, but I'm having dinner with my best friend at such and such place. And if you are around and would be open to meeting in person for like a coffee or a dessert or something later on, let me know because we'll be here for a little while. And I, you know, and she did, and you know, and it was a great thing that happened because I didn't plan it.
Yeah, it's almost better.
And it, yeah, and so I didn't have like all of the anxiety and the anticipation of like having to wait for that moment. It just kind of the universe put it in my path, and it just happened.
Maybe for her too, because she could just kind of go, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how was it? Was it just, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we had been having some really great, easy conversations already. And so just meeting her, you know, things that you know, we use our hands in the same way. I'm like, oh, we have the same hands. Like we like we hold our hands exact like the and the way we use them,
yeah, it's all those little things that you lacked growing up, you know, not having the mirroring growing up.
yeah.
When it happens, it's so affirming.
Mhm.
Did your siblings know about you?
No, so well, yes, actually. So I have three half siblings. And she had told me, she's like, listen, they have known about you from the time they were able to understand.
Oh.
Because what had happened was my sister Pam, she, when she was like in second grade or something, had to write, and she told me this story, she had to write an essay about something, about, she had to pick a topic and write an essay, and she's like, I don't know why, but for some reason I picked adoption. And so I wrote this essay, and then I brought it to mom, and I was like, hey, can you help me, I have to do this assignment for school. And at that point, then Mary said, okay, well, I want to tell you something. And she, the kids knew, and so they always knew. She didn't, which was, I think, a really good thing,
Yeah.
because I know that that's such a challenge for a lot of adoptees, is that their mothers have kept the secret and have not told anyone, have not told other kids and other family.
Yeah.
And then it becomes really hard when we show up as adults and are like, hi,
Right.
and so they always knew. So that was really great, because then I was able to connect, for a time with my sister. Unfortunately, she died 2 years ago.
Oh,
Another
sorry.
really painful part of my
Yeah.
story.
Wow.
2 summers ago, when we first moved to Michigan, I got a call. I woke up in the morning and I listened to a voicemail from Mary, and I like, and she was like, I'm sorry that I have to leave you this message, but I just heard that Pam died. And I was like, oh my God. Like, and I physically felt it. Like, I have
Yeah.
never experienced, because it was like, this is the first person
Yeah.
that I'm related to that I've lost. And like, we had just found each other, right? We'd only, had a couple of years worth of starting to connect. And she was, like 18 months younger than me. Like, we were really close in
I'm
age.
so
And
sorry.
thank you. And
Time is such the thief sometimes, right? For adoptees, because the way we have to wait and then put off and find and
mhm,
oh.
So
and
sorry. That's traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
it is. And like, I don't think I will ever get over it. I was actually just emailing another adoptee who heard me on another podcast recently, and like reached out to me and said, well, thank you for, being so brave and sharing your story. And she was sharing, she was on her way to go see her sister, and she shared a little bit of her story with me. And then I was like, then I shared back about this, what happened with my sister, and how, like, and it hit me like, I don't think I will ever get over this.
No.
Mm.
And then it's sort of that full circle, because it takes me back to that moment in my class when my classmate's story about her sister
Mhm.
brought all this stuff up, right? And how that allowed me to start to think about my own story and my own connections.
And Liz, life is so
Well,
connected.
I mean, your story is so powerful, and the way you tell it, and all of it is just, your pain is the gain of other people who,
It is.
and that's kind of how I think of our podcast too. Like, it's painful and but helpful.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up, but there's so much more we could even. I do want to know about your father, because that piece is not known, and I'm so happy that you're in reunion with Mary,
Yeah.
and and but
Yeah.
did you find him?
So I have his name written on a little tiny piece of paper in my wallet that I've been carrying around probably since 2019.
Oh gosh, you're like me. Hello.
Because I for a while, Mary couldn't remember his name.
Yeah.
And I actually don't know that full story. And I haven't figured out what questions to ask yet still.
Yeah.
So and she has always said to me, like, I'm willing to tell you whatever you want to know. Like, you can ask me anything. So that's an open invitation. I just haven't figured out what it is I want to ask. But she couldn't remember his name for a long time. And then she did. And then the last, when I was visiting the area in 2019. We went to lunch and she was like, "Oh, I want to give you his name." And I haven't done anything with it because I don't know if that's a road that I want to go down. I don't think he knows that I exist.
Yeah.
And that feels really fraught for me. And also the thing that I've always lived with was that I was always curious about my mother. I always wanted to know who Mary was and what her story was. And I always knew that if and when I had the chance to find her, that she would want to know me, and that turned out to be true. I'd never had the same curiosity about my biological father. So that's a TBD.
That's so
Okay.
common. That's so
Well,
common.
I know you'll tell us when this comes down. This has just been such a great conversation, and
Gosh,
really grateful you're in our lives, that you came on
it's
to tell your story.
really
And
grateful.
yeah, as always, when I hear you talk, I'm on the verge of tears. So
Right? And just deep thought, you elicit a lot of deep thought from people. And here's another thing. It's nice to hear that you're just not all fine and dandy with everything. You've done all this work. You still have all this work, and we all do. And I think that's nice for our listeners to hear.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's an ever evolving
Mm-hmm.
journey,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it sure is.
It's the mole game. Tackle one thing, something else pops up.
Yeah. Yes, we should make that adoptee whack-a-mole.
Yes.
What if we've been
We're
not
like,
You know
doing
what?
this?
That's actually a really funny
is.
idea.
It
And
is.
you have names for it, like, little,
Rejection,
yes,
abandonment.
chameleon,
yes,
pretzel.
You guys, we've
falsified
had
birth
a
records.
$1 million idea here.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, all
Thank
right,
you.
Liz. Thank you so much. Lots of love.
Lots of
Lots
love.
of love to you both. Thank you
See
so
you
much for
soon.
having me.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll see you soon.
Okay.